In this video, let's discuss Vue's lifecycle. To be more specific, it is a Vue components lifecycle. We'll discuss components in depth in the next video, but for now, think of a Vue component as a file with .vue extension. So far, there is only one Vue component in our application, app.vue. It turns out that when we start a Vue application, each Vue component goes through a series of initialization steps when it is created. For example, a component needs to set up the data observation for reactive data, compile the template, mount itself to the DOM. From there, update the DOM when reactive data change. Along the way, it also runs some special functions called lifecycle hook functions, or simply hooks, giving developers the opportunity to add their own code at specific stages. I summarized some key states of a Vue component using a UML state machine diagram. Let's take a look. This is an oversimplified state diagram for Vue. Many details are left out here, but I think it's enough to understand the key concepts in Vue's lifecycle. The light purple rectangles with rounded corners represent valid states of a Vue component. Note that at one time, a Vue component can only be in exactly one state. It starts in the initial state, which is denoted by a filled black circle. The final state of a component is denoted by a circle with a dot inside. That is the start and end of a component's life. The arrows represent state transitions. For example, after a Vue component is created, it transitions to the setup state. Once it finishes setting up, it transitions to the before mount state. Some transitions have triggers, like this one and this one. It means that this external event will trigger the state transition. A transition without a trigger like this is called a completion transition. It is triggered automatically when the source state of the transition has completed its activity. What is this entry/method call inside a state? For example, entry/setup. That is an internal activity of a state. It means as soon as a Vue component enters this state, it will invoke this setup method. So for example, here we got setup, onBeforeMount, onMounted, onBeforeUpdate, onUpdated, onBeforeUnmount, and onUnmounted. We call them lifecycle hooks. We'll explain them one by one later. So let's briefly walk through the states in this diagram. Once a Vue component instance is created, it moves to the setup state and invokes the setup method. In this method, we have access to the props. Don't worry, we'll explain that in a future video, and can set up reactive data, defining methods, computed properties, and watchers. Actually, we have been doing this all the time. As a matter of fact, this script setup syntax is a shorthand and a syntactical sugar for the setup hook function. So actually, we have been using this hook all the time, right? Once we're done here, Vue transitions to the before mount state. When Vue is in this state, the component has not been mounted to the DOM tree, so we cannot access the HTML elements defined in the template of a component. Do you remember template refs we discussed in the last video? At this state, we cannot use template refs to refer to an HTML element in the template. I will show a demo to prove this later. And of course, the onBeforeMount hook is executed. Then after this, it transitions to the mounted state. By now, the component instance is mounted to the DOM. The HTML elements are accessible within the onMounted hook function. So in the onMounted function, feel free to use template refs. We can have access to the elements in the template. It turns out that this onMounted function is the most often used lifecycle hook. For example, we can use the fetch API or Axios to request some data from a remote API endpoint in this hook function. Once the onMounted hook function is done, the Vue component will sit in this mounted state waiting for external events like DOM updates or component is unmounted. If nothing happens, it will sit in this state forever. That would be boring, right? Let's say due to the reactive data change, the DOM needs an update. So the component will first transition to the before update state to prepare for updating the DOM and re-render the component. The onBefore update hook is then called. After that, Vue will update the DOM tree so we can see the new content in the HTML. Then Vue will transition to the updated state, where the onUpdated hook is called. Finally, it transitions back to the mounted state and waits for the next event. When the component is unmounted, Vue moves to the before unmount state, invoking the onBefore unmount hook function. Then this component is removed from the DOM and moves to the unmounted state, where it executes the onUnmounted hook function to clean things up, like timers, DOM event listeners, or server connections. Finally, this component is completely gone. End of the story. As you can see here, I highlighted the most commonly used lifecycle hooks. They are unmounted, unupdated, and unmounted. I know this sounds very boring, so let's work on an example. Let's go to VS Code. First, let me create a Git branch for this Vue concept, so it will be easier for you to review the code later. Git branch, lifecycle, hooks, git switch. Okay. Now we're on branch lifecycle hooks. Let's get familiar with the starter code. In script, we defined 3 ref data, message, number, and title. And here we used message and number in mustache notation. And here this title is actually a template ref, like here. So we have access to the h2 element in the script. Recall that this script here is really the setup hook function. It is just a shorthand or syntactical sugar. Okay, and here is a button. If I click increment number by 1, number will increase. So this is a very simple example that we defined in the component app.vue. All right, next, I'm going to define the other 6 lifecycle hook functions. So first here, let me console log a message. App component is setup. So this line will be executed in the setup method, which is here. And we don't have to define setup method because line 11 to line 20 is already in the setup method. All right, next, let's define onBefore mount. It is very simple. onBefore mount. Make sure you import this hook function from Vue. This method takes a callback function as an argument. The idea is very simple. When this component app.vue enters before mount state, this callback will get invoked. All right, first, let's print a message. App component is before mount. To prove my point, in this hook function, I'm going to access 2 ref data that we defined up here. One is the number and one is the title. Okay, so console.log number, console.log title. Recall that number is a data and the title is a template ref that refers to h2. All right, so refresh. Next, I'm going to press F12 and show you the console. So can you tell me what are printed in the console? Will this be printed? Will this be printed? What about the two variables here? What are their values? Let's take a look. Let me first clear the console. So when I refresh, this app.vue component will be created again and go through the lifecycle state diagram I showed you before. So refresh. Okay, let's take a look. Pay attention to the order. The first statement that gets executed is line 18. App component is set up. Because the component goes to the setup state first. That's why the setup hook function gets called first. And then the component enters before mount and execute the onBeforeMount hook function. So we have app component is before mount, and then line 22 prints 1. No problem. It has access to the reactive data we defined up here. However, the template ref title is not ready yet. That's why here it is undefined, because at this moment, everything here is not mounted to DOM. There's nothing there. So we get undefined. So it's not a good idea to use template refs in onBeforeMount. We probably want to use it in a later hook function. For example, Unmounted. Okay, line 20 to 24, we are registering a callback to be called right before the component is to be mounted. That is why it's called onBeforeMount. When this hook is called, the component has finished setting up its reactive state. So we have access to number. No DOM nodes have been created yet. That's why we cannot access title.value, this h2 element. And here I also want to explain the term mounted, because we have been using it without formally defining it. A component is considered mounted after all of its synchronous child components have been mounted. You will see an example later. Its own DOM tree has been created and inserted into the parent container. Note, it only guarantees that the component's DOM tree is in document if the application's root container is also in document. Let's move on to the next state, mounted. Unmounted, and make sure you import unmounted from Vue. The syntax is similar. So here we're going to pass a callback function to this unmounted method. And here we're going to do the same. First, console.log app component is mounted. So this function gets called when the app component is done mounting, is completely mounted, it's ready. Console.log, and let's try to access title.value. We're pretty sure that we can access number.value since we can access here, so I'm not going to test it here. Okay, now let me refresh. Now pay attention to the console. All right, as you can see, app component is mounted, and we have access to the h2 element. So if you're trying to manipulate HTML elements through template refs, you can choose to do it in the onMounted hook function. So in summary, line 26 to line 29, we are registering a callback to be called after the component has been mounted. This hook is called after the component has been mounted, meaning that the component's template and the DOM have been fully initialized. This is a suitable time to perform tasks like fetching data from an API endpoint, because the component is fully set up, fully ready, and you can safely interact with the DOM or initiate side effects like data fetching. I want to say this is the most commonly used lifecycle hook function. On the screen, you can see an example of fetching data using the onMounted hook function. It's a good place to initialize the reactive data that we defined in a component. Next, I'm going to work on onBeforeUpdate, onUpdated, onBeforeUnmount, and onUnmounted offline. All right, so first, make sure you import all of them from Vue. As you can see here, we're importing a lot of hook functions. Let me scroll down. So here is on before update, on updated, on before unmount, and on unmounted. Their implementations are very simple. Basically, we just print a message to indicate that this hook function is executed. All right, so let me refresh here. Pay attention to the console. Well, we're not seeing those 4 statements, which is understandable because we're not updating anything. We're not unmounting anything, right? Now, next, let's try to test on before update and on updated. So let me clean this. I'm going to make an update to this HTML element. Number goes from 1 to 2 by clicking increment number by 1. Now pay attention to console. What happened? On before update gets called first, and then on updated is called. Do it again, again, and again. That proves my point. So line 37 to 39, we are registering a hook to be called right before the component is about to update its DOM tree due to a reactive state change. I really want to emphasize that updating its DOM tree will trigger this on before update and also on updated. Because if you look at the lifecycle diagram provided by the official document, it says data changes trigger the on before update hook function. This is a little misleading. It is the DOM updates or the DOM tree changes trigger the on before update and on updated. Let's try. So for example, let me refresh this to bring this back to 1. Let me comment out this line. So now you cannot see number colon and the value of the number, right? So let me refresh. Okay. And then clean up this. In this case, I'm also going to click increment number by 1. So tell me, do you think the number will be incremented? Of course, because here we are adding 1 to number. We're not showing it in the DOM tree. But the number is indeed incremented. Okay, let's click increment number by 1. Do you think this time the on before update and on updated will get called? Let's try. Click increment number by 1. Click again, again, again. Nothing happened. So that means on before update and on updated will only be triggered if elements in the DOM get changed. Okay, now let's go to Vue extension and check the content in number. As you can see, now it's 5. Keep clicking, clicking. And here I probably need a refresh. Now it's 10, right? But if you go back to console, nothing is printed. So that proves my point. It is the DOM updates or DOM changes that trigger on before update and on updated. Okay, there is another point here. Do you remember watchers? We use watchers to watch reactive data changes, right? So which one gets called first? On before update or the watcher? Who gets called first? Let's give it a try. So for example, down here, let's define a watcher. Oh, by the way, the order we define them doesn't really matter. So here we have a watcher. Make sure we import it. And let's say we're watching the number variable. Okay, and here we're gonna pass in a callback and console.log number changes. Okay, and of course, let me go up here and uncomment this line because we do want to trigger on before update. So let me refresh and clean this. Okay, now we have both watcher and the 2 hook functions on before update and on updated. Now let me click increment number by 1. Can you tell me what is the order? Who gets called first? Watchers or hook functions? All right, let's see. Now pay attention to the console. Okay, it seems like watcher gets called first. Well, that makes sense because this watcher only cares about this number, right? In this case, this number gets updated first. Then Vue will update the DOM tree because the number changes. So we change it here first. It goes back to here. Thanks to reactivity, Vue will update every place that refers to the number variable. So the data gets changed first, then the DOM tree gets changed second. That explains why the watcher got executed first. So let's continue on before update. This hook can be used to access the DOM state before Vue updates the DOM. It is also safe to modify the component state inside this hook function. So feel free to modify any reactive data in this onBeforeUpdate hook function. Now, let me show some use cases of onBeforeUpdate. If you need to read from the DOM before it is updated, for example, to save scroll positions or perform measurements that depend on the current state of the DOM, onBeforeUpdate is the perfect place. This allows you to capture necessary information from the current DOM before it changes. Okay, next, let's talk about line 41 to 43 on updated. Here, we are registering a callback to be called after the component has updated its DOM tree due to a reactive state change, like in this case, number change. Again, don't confuse this with watchers who only care about reactive data change. This may not make sense for now. A parent component's updated hook function is called after that of its child components. All right, next, let's talk about onBeforeUnmount and onUnmounted. To demonstrate these two hook functions and also make this demo more interesting, let's create a second component as the child component of this app.vue. As you can see right now under SRC, there's only one component, app.vue. So let's create the second one. Let's call this component1.vue. And let me copy and paste in the starter code for component 1. And paste. So make sure you know that we have two components under SRC. So let me collapse this and collapse this. This component 1 is very simple. We only have a H2 here. This is a component 1 component. And we have a different background color, aqua, and padding and margin. It is not shown here because we haven't put it into the app.vue. This component also imports various livehook functions. And just printing very simple messages like here in setup, before mount, mounted, before update, updated, before unmount, unmounted. Very simple one. Next, let's use component 1 inside the app component as a child component. To use a component, first we need to import it. So after importing all those methods from Vue, we can also import a component from the current directory, component1.vue. Okay. After importing, we can use component 1 in the template, just like an HTML element. Copy this, and let's put it here. Paste. All right, there we go. Think of the code at line 7 as a placeholder. The HTML code in the template of component 1, this part, will replace the code at line 7. So if the content in component 1 changes, the change will be synchronized here as well. It is very good. That's called component nesting. Okay, so far so good. Now let me clear the console. Then refresh the page. I want you to pay attention to the console and see the order of the messages. Refresh. All right, so here we have more messages. So let me scroll down. The very first message is here. App component, the parent component, is set up. No surprise. Then we go to onBeforeMount. App component is before mount. And then we print number.value, which is 1. And then we print title.value is null. We have no access there. Then, wait a sec. Where is my app component is mounted? Oh, it's down here. What's going on? And in between, we have, let me go to component 1. Component 1 is set up. Okay, so that's the setup hook function in the child component. Then component 1 is before mount. And then component 1 is mounted. And then the parent component is mounted. So it looks like the parent component is waiting for all its child components to be ready, to be mounted, before it is mounted. Recall that a component is considered mounted after all of its synchronous child components have been mounted. So the parent component is the last one that is mounted. So the hook function onMounted in the parent component is the last one that gets called. It is called after all the unmounted methods of its child components get called. I know this is a mouthful, right? So feel free to pause the video and rewatch this part. And of course, here then we have access to title.value. That's right here. Okay. Now remember, I want to demo to you the on before onMount and on unmounted. So to make this interesting, let's create another button called button toggle component 1. So what I want to do here is if I click this button, this component 1 will disappear. And if I click again, it will appear again. All right, so apparently for a toggle button, we need a toggle variable to control it. So add click. So for example, let's use is show. We haven't defined that yet. So let's go down here. Let's define this is show. And by default, it is true. Okay, then let's go up here and put a v-if is show. So refresh. Let me clean this. Now next, I'm going to click this toggle component 1. I want you to pay attention to the console. And also here, the on before onMount and on unmounted. Okay, so let's click toggle. What happened? Well, component 1 is gone. No surprise. Thanks to v-if, it unmounted this component. Okay, so if this one becomes false, this entire component will be removed or unmounted from its parent's DOM tree. Look at the console log. Does it make sense to you? The first hook function that gets called is the on before update. Here, app component is before update. Well, for sure, because the DOM changes, right? Now, before we call app component is updated, in the middle, Vue is invoking on before onMount and on unmounted in the component 1, right? When everything's done, when the component 1 is completely removed, on updated in the parent component app.vue gets called. All right, let's do it again. But this time, let's bring it back. So think about this. Before I click, what will happen? This time, component 1 is recreated. So let's go to component 1. That means it will go through this again. Setup, on before mount, unmounted. But for app, it will first go through on before update and finish at on updated. So let's see. So let's click toggle component. All right, app component is before update. App component is updated. In the middle, component 1 setup, before mount, mounted. So a small summary for on before onMount. So here, we're registering a hook to be called right before a component instance is to be unmounted. When this hook is called, the component instance is still fully functional. So we can access the data and things we defined in this component. Now the next one, on unmounted. Here we're registering a callback to be called after the component has been unmounted. And a component is considered unmounted after all of its child components have been unmounted. So if component 1 has more child components, we'll first unmount the child components of component 1 and then unmount component 1. And also, a component is considered unmounted after all of its associated reactive effects, like render effect, computed properties, watchers that we created in the script setup have been stopped. So basically kind of clean up the house. So a very common use case of onUnmounted is to use this hook function to clean up manually created side effects, such as timers, DOM event listeners, or server connections. Okay, like this example on the screen. Let's do a quick summary here. Vue Lifecycle hooks are functions that give you, the developers, the opportunity to add your own code at specific stages of a component's lifecycle, so you can be part of it. From setup to onUnmounted, these hooks allow you to execute code at various points in a component's life, enabling you to integrate your logic seamlessly with Vue's reactivity system. The most commonly used hooks are onMounted, onUpdated, and onUnmounted. In onMounted, we usually fetch data from remote API endpoints and use the response to initialize the ref data that we define in the component. So it's very useful. Use onUpdated when you need to access or manipulate the DOM immediately after it has been updated by Vue's reactivity system. It is ideal for operations like applying third-party plugins, focusing elements for accessibility, or performing animations. You can also use that for logging or debugging purposes related to update cycle. onUpdate can also be used to measure the performance of certain operations or rendering times. By placing performance markers in onUpdated, you can get a better idea of how changes affect the performance of your component. For onUnmounted, we use it to clean up things like timers, DOM event listeners, or server connections. Basically, we use it to release resources. Next, let me push this branch to GitHub. Git add, git commit, lifecycle hooks, git push, okay. In the next video, let's talk about Vue components. I'm pretty sure you're very interested in Vue components, parent components, and child components. Vue components are the building blocks of a Vue application and can make your Vue application scale up easily. See you in the next video.